All right, I've just reread Frankenstein, and I've got a couple of things to say about it. Now, normally when I read a book that is so well known and so commonly read as Frankenstein, I don't usually make a video about it because these books, especially like classical literature, and this book in particular, everything is so interconnected. It feels like it's very difficult to say one thing about Frankenstein without having to sort of like pull apart and explicate the entire novel. So, for the purposes of dealing with this problem, I have written a list here of 8 points that I want to make about Frankenstein. I'm going to try really, really hard not to let every single point devolve into an explanation of the entire novel. But anyway, here we go. So, I want to start with the most interesting observation that I have about Frankenstein. It's the main thing I would say. It's the main thing that I have to say. The only observation on this list that I think you probably haven't heard before, or that is uncommon. I at least haven't seen it before. Um, I think Frankenstein is an incel novel. I think that thematically, in terms of its focus and in terms of its concern, Frankenstein is a novel about what it's like to be an incel. Now, obviously, the concept of an incel did not exist at the time that Mary Shelley was writing, but essentially, the monster lives in a world where all of the concerns of of incels are just objectively correct for him, right? So let's think about this. The monster's number one problem is that he is abandoned. I guess the number one problem is that he's abandoned by his creator, right? And that has left him with serious mother issues, mother, father, etc. issues. Uh, but the thing that he actually points to, the thing that the monster actually points to as his number one problem, is I'm mad because no GF, right? So for those of you who haven't read the novel, what happens is the monster experiences rejection because of his appearance. He's so like ugly and disgusting. And I think so. I recently taught this novel to a bunch of high schoolers, right? And I think there's something kind of interesting here, which is that you need to imagine that the monster has some sort of like supernatural trait with his appearance, right? He is just supernaturally ugly, right? It's just a fact that anyone who sees him is automatically going to reject him. Because I think if you like allow your imagination to kind of devolve into like, okay, what does this guy actually look like? You know? Well, any actual appearance that we can imagine, we could probably get over it, right? Like no matter how ugly he actually looks, like someone could probably get over it, yeah? But instead of, you know, that's unimportant. We need to put that out of our minds. We need to just accept, right, that this creature is so supernaturally ugly that no one will ever accept them. And by the way, I think that this problem of okay, what does the creature actually look like? The issue of actually showing us a monster that is so ugly that you understand why everyone would immediately be repelled by him and like want to throw rocks at him. Uh, is, I suspect, a reason that the story of Frankenstein is told in such a different way in films, right? Because it's hard, and in fact, I would say, like, not really possible to show us a monster that actually looks the way that Mary Shelley, like, says that he looks, right? If you showed us something on screen that was like super duper disgusting, I don't think you could get us to a point where all of humanity, all of us would be agreed, like, that's horrible, get that thing away from me. Okay, anyway, I've just given you a great example of how like every topic is connected to every other topic. But the point that I'm trying to make, right, is that Frankenstein is an incel novel, and a crucial component of that is that the monster's number one problem is how fucking ugly he is. Like, if the monster had just been born beautiful, I don't think he would have the problems that he actually has. And that is essentially the incel worldview, right? Incels view themselves as having lost the genetic lottery. They're just too ugly for love, and this makes them extremely bitter and ultimately violent. And that is exactly what happens to the monster. That is a description of the fucking plot of Frankenstein, right? Okay, so the monster, he hunkers down in like a basically a pigsty, right? And he's able to observe this family. And Frankenstein is a romantic novel, so the things that he observes are like this family being really, really nice to each other. And Mary Shelley is doing like typical romantic novel type stuff of trying to show us the sublime in human interactions, in human relationships, right? She's showing us wretched, this wretched situation that this family has been thrown into and how they overcome it through love and bonds of affection. but she also has us watching this sort of through the creature's eyes. And all of this beauty causes a very different feeling in him because he knows that he's locked out of this, right? And he suspects that he's locked out of this forever and permanently, it's unavoidable. So he makes a plan to be accepted into this family, the DeLacy family. The plan is, it sort of hinges on a like confession type situation where he like presents himself suddenly to the DeLacy's and he kind of confronts them and puts them in a situation where they have to either accept or reject him. It reminds me a lot actually of the way that a lot of young men confess their like first crushes, right? Like it's a very much a confession, right? It's a confrontation, it's a showdown. And of course, this doesn't work out, right? Because he looks like a fucking monster, right? In the eyes of the DeLacy's, this monster has just broken into their home and is harassing them, and they respond in a way that's very understandable, which is that they freak out and they try to get him, to fuck off, and then they leave, and then they run away, traumatized forever. And the monster is also traumatized forever. The monster concludes from this and a couple of other occurrences that he is just forever cast out from humanity. And the thing that he really focuses in on is, so I want to kind of explain the symbolic dimensions of this, right? Because the thing that he focuses in on is, I'm mad because no GF. But Mary Shelley wants us to understand that there's something more important here than just like the monster wants to get it in. There's something more important here. It's true that the monster does want to get it in. The monster's like, I want GF, I want to have sex, etc., so on and so forth. But all of that is not really like the core of what he's going after, right? The core of what he's going after is that he wants to be a part of a family. And he understands that being a part of a family is in some way connected to being able to have sex. Yeah? And the thing that makes him so upset is not exactly that he doesn't have a GF. The thing that makes him so upset is that he's been excluded from this institution called the family, right? He's seen how beautiful family life can be, and he wants that for himself, and it's just forever denied to him. And so this ultimately results in the monster lashing out, in particular, lashing out against women, which is interesting because, as one of my students point out, women never really do anything directly bad to him, right? Whenever he gets attacked, whenever people throw rocks at him, whenever he's like violently accosted, it's always a man doing it. And somehow his ire is, if anything, particularly directed towards women and children. He directs his violence not against the people or even the type of people that are attacking him. He directs his violence against targets that sort of symbolize family life, right? He directs his violence against the women who would never view him as a potential romantic partner, and he directs his violence against children who, I guess, in some sense symbolize the institution of the family, right? So I think this also parallels incel violence, right? It's been noted that incels, although they're very, very angry at women, they disproportionately end up killing men, right? They usually, like, even though the target that they want to be violent against are women, they often end up just like killing a bunch of men. So yeah, I don't really know. I'm sure there's more that can be teased apart in this observation. But yeah, that's like my core. That's the flag that I'm putting in the sand. Frankenstein is an incel novel at its heart. It's not a surface level comparison. The core thematic elements of Frankenstein are also the core concerns of the incel community. Okay, great. That's the like really smart thing that I have to say. The rest of this is just going to be like kind of random observations. So this time that I read the novel, I was really interested in this kind of telescoping nature that the novel has. If you have read, if you've studied this in a literature class, your teacher probably told you about the frame narrative of the novel, right? It starts out as an epistolary novel. Epistolary? I don't know how to say that word. I'm going to guess epistolary. It starts out as an epistolary novel where this guy Walden is writing letters, right? And he's trying to go to the North Pole, and then he runs into this Frankenstein guy who's like floating on a raft of ice, and he picks him up, and Frankenstein's like, "You and I, we're not so different. Let me tell you about the most fucked up shit that ever happened to me." And then Frankenstein tells his whole story, and then we come back to Walden, and Walden's like, "Whoa, that's crazy." Um, and that's the frame narrative, right? That's explained in like every English class ever. But here's the thing, right? Within Frankenstein's narrative, so we've got Walden watching Frankenstein, and within Frankenstein's narrative, he eventually gets to a point where he sits down and the creature says, I'm not as evil as you probably think I am. Let me tell you my story. So then, within Frankenstein's narrative, we're listening to the creature. And then, within the creature's narrative, there comes a point where he's hiding in this pigsty and he's watching the DeLacy family, right? So within the monster's narrative, we're watching the DeLacy's and where they essentially become the subject of the novel. And then within the DeLacy uh, chapters, within the DeLacy section, there comes a point at which this character Safi is like reintroduced, and everyone has to kind of explain what's been going on. And uh, I think it's Fee. It doesn't matter, but the DeLacy's essentially have a story that is told to them, so that they're all on the same page about what happened to them and how they became poor and how they got into the situation. And it involves like events occurring during the French Revolution and acts of sublime and selfless justice, acts of staggering betrayal, characters falling in love at first sight, that type of stuff. Like the story is essentially a condensed. You could easily imagine that someone may have written a romantic novel about all of the stuff that the DeLacy's are saying, right? But what's so weird is, first of all, the story that is at the very center of Frankenstein. First of all, like the telescoping structure is just very strange. I don't quite know what to make of it. It's genius, and sometimes you can tell that an author is genius because they've done something that is so incomprehensible, but it just fucking works. My favorite example of this is the second chapter of Crime and Punishment. After the first chapter of Crime and Punishment, you're very interested in this Raskolnikov guy and you want to know what his deal is. And the second chapter of Crime and Punishment is Raskolnikov walks into a bar and this guy you've never met before says, "Sit down, let me tell you my whole life story." And then you never see that guy. Well, you see that guy one more time when he's dying. You see that guy again on his deathbed. Um, that's my favorite example of an author just being touched by genius. None of us can comprehend why they made this choice, but it somehow just like super duper works. And I think the equivalent structure for Mary Shelley is this telescoping narrative. Like if someone sat me down and was like, I want to write a novel where in the novel someone tells a story, and in that story someone tells a story, and in that story someone observes a family living their life, and in that observation they sit down and tell a story, and then we go layer, 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 and then we have to come out of that again. And that whole like onion-like structure is going to be the novel. I would say, you're smoking crack. Why don't you just tell the story in a normal way? But alas, Mary Shelley is a genius, and so she knows. She just has the sauce, right? It just works. I'd really like to understand why it works. I'd really like to understand what it's doing, but I guess I just don't. The thing that puzzles me the most here is that the anecdote that makes up the very center of this novel, like the center of the center of the center of the center, that anecdote is extremely like predictable. It's pretty simple. Like it's a story that as a standalone story just wouldn't be very good. And I don't really see it talked about very much, probably because it's really boring, right? So basically, the way that it goes is that there's this like Turkish guy, and there's like some intrigues during the French Revolution, and he basically gets thrown in jail, right? The French revolutionary government throws him in jail, and this guy Felix hears about this and is like, "That's bullshit. That guy has basically been thrown in jail just because he's a Muslim." That's the Felix's understanding of the situation, is that this is totally unfair. Like he's facing religious persecution, so he makes plans to like help this guy break out of jail, basically. And as he's making those plans, he meets this Muslim guy, and he meets the guy's daughter, right? And he instantly falls in love with the daughter. Um, the Muslim guy encourages them to like fall in love. Basically, doesn't quite say, but heavily implies, "Once we're done with this, you're gonna get to marry my beautiful daughter." So Felix breaks them out of jail. They all escape across the border, and then the Turk viciously betrays them. Not really sure why, but Felix is completely betrayed, and he has to essentially escape. He gets exiled from France. He has to live in some fucking cabin in the woods. And this guy was like formerly a member of the nobility, right? So his newfound like peasant lifestyle is really unpleasant to him and his family. Oh, also his family get imprisoned at some point, and then he's able to get them back, but they all get exiled. So those are the DeLacy's, right? And eventually, what happens is the daughter just shows up, and she's like, you know, I do love you, and my father's betrayal was horrible, and they're reunited, and that's the core story, right? Like, okay, it's fine, right? If it was just like a random story someone was telling, I would be like, well written, but like you need to like kind of surprise us in some way, right? As a standalone story, it's pretty boring. So I'm quite puzzled as to why this makes up the heart of um of Frankenstein. I suppose I can understand some of what's being put down here, right? Like Frankenstein as a story is kind of about this like thematically it sort of like twists the ideas of romanticism, right? So you have this sublime family story, something that seems like it could have come out of Les Mis, right? And you've got the monster watching it, knowing that nothing like this will ever happen to him. That all of these people that are capable of such depths of emotion and depths of selflessness, nonetheless, they look at him and he's just not a part of humanity. He just does not belong. And that does lend it some interest. Uh, but I don't know. It's still weird that it's just like not a very good story. One thing that's kind of interesting is that by the time you do get to the center of this novel, there's it's a really simple story, but there's a lot to unpack in terms of who is reading this story. Like you're reading it, and by now you've accumulated a whole crowd of people that are also listening to this story. Because you've got to keep in mind, this story is being told, and the DeLacy's are listening to it and coming to an understanding of what has been happening. And the monster, so that's, uh, I'm going to call them one person, but it's a group of people, right? And then the monster is watching that story be told, and he's coming to a certain understanding about it. And then Frankenstein is listening to the monster's narration of watching that story being told, and he's coming to his own understanding of that. And then Frankenstein is narrating all of that to Walden, which is, like you've got this whole crowd of people reading or listening to the story with you, which is it makes for a very, I don't know, it makes for a very analyzable short story. Like there's a lot to unpack there. Okay, great. That's the weird telescoping structure. My next point is the parallels between Frankenstein and the monster. I uh I don't know, maybe this is kind of a basic point, but I guess on my previous readings I hadn't really noticed how kind of fundamentally similar they are, right? Both of them are extreme in the way that they make decisions, and both of them, I think they jump to extremes, right? Like for instance, the monster when he's rejected by the DeLacy's and then rejected by other people. The monster, by the way, he has a really good plan. One of the DeLacy's is blind. The patriarch of the family is blind, and he says, "Okay, this guy won't be able to see me, and I'll go in there and I'll sort of explain what's happening to him, and then he will be like my ambassador to the DeLacy's, right?" This is a really good plan, in my opinion, but it is ultimately interrupted by the DeLacy's like coming home early or something, and they see the monster, and of course anyone who sees him instantly hates him, and they're no different, and they throw him out of the house, and they freak out, and it's over, right? Well, the monster had a really good plan and it just didn't work. But the monster's conclusion is so extreme. He's like, I am fundamentally unlovable. There's nothing no one will ever accept me. Like, brother, you just had a conversation with this blind guy where he was like, "Oh my God, yeah, you're such an unfortunate. Come in, sit down. I'll help you however I can." Like, there is ample evidence against the monster's conclusion, but because of this situation that he's been put in, he like allows his emotions. Like the monster is actually quite logical, but he allows his emotions to set the sort of like framework for how that logic is going to be used. And Victor Frankenstein is just the same way, right? He's very logical. He's very capable of utilizing logic to come to some kind of conclusion. But his emotional state and his like preconceptions are not really challenged by that logic. Instead, the emotions set the framework for how Victor Frankenstein is going to actually use logic in his life, which is definitely a parallel with the monster. Another thing that they do, and I want to make kind of a weird comparison, which is to Jace from the animated series Arcane. So I've watched Arcane a couple of times, and the first time I watched it, I was like, Jace is really boring. Jace is like the boring character at the center of a show with like a lot of really interesting characters. And then the second time that I watched it, I sort of started to understand what was interesting about Jace. He's a little bit of an everyman, he's a little bit plain, but he has one characteristic that is, in my opinion, once you notice it, it's pretty interesting, and it is also the engine for the plot. And that characteristic is that he's a flip flopper, right? He has strong convictions, but as soon as those convictions are overturned, he flips 180 degrees in the opposite direction, and he has even stronger convictions this time against what he just believed. And I think that at first this made me think that he was like a really like a boring character. Like this character doesn't like really believe anything. Um but once I understood what was going on, once I understood the structure there, I got that he has extremely strong convictions. Those convictions are just not immovable in the way that other characters' convictions are, right? Generally, a character that is like driven by strong convictions, those convictions stay the same. But Jace is different. Those convictions change. They flip back and forth. He's like, okay, whatever. You get the idea. He's flipping back and forth, right? And that in no way dilutes or limits the strength of his convictions. It makes him a much more unpredictable and a much more changeable character than a lot of the other characters are, which is interesting because like the other thing is that this fundamental structure doesn't change over the course of the show, or at least over the course of season one, right? This thing, like, although Jace is like changing his opinion all the time, the fundamental structure of like Jace being extremely convinced of something until those convictions are overturned, and then he's extremely convinced of the opposite thing, that structure doesn't change. Like the fundamental essence of Jace does not change. And what I noticed in this read through of Frankenstein is that Frankenstein is pretty much the exact same way. To some extent, I don't think he flip flops quite as much as Jace does, but he has this powerful ambition to create a guy, right? And then the fucking millisecond that he creates a guy and it goes wrong, he had all these ideas about like becoming the father to a new race and defeating death and blah blah blah, and those convictions are definitively overturned when he actually lays eyes on the monster. And it's not just that he changes his mind, it's that he then eventually develops an equally powerful obsession with the opposite idea, which is that he needs to destroy and eliminate the monster. He needs to undo his own mistake. And the structure of obsession, and the structure where like his personal take on the situation and basically the way that he feels about it delimits the ways that he can use logic, right? That structure doesn't change. It's just that the core conviction at the heart of that is like taken out and replaced with its opposite over the course of the novel. And the monster does the same thing, right? The monster does the exact same thing. He has this really strong desire to be accepted within the human community, and he faces a situation that convinces him that that is totally impossible. And within a relatively short period of time, he takes that conviction and he replaces it with its opposite, which is that I need to find some way to live outside of the human community. I need to completely detach. And ultimately, when that doesn't work either, he just decides that he is going to punish humanity as much as he has been punished. Okay. And the next thing I want to talk about is probably going to be kind of boring to to most viewers, which is the parallels between crime, the parallels with the novel Crime and Punishment. So Victor, I guess what I want to say is that the structure of Victor's transgressions is pretty similar to the structure of Crime and Punishment. Both novels are responding to the sort of like trends of the literature of their day, which mainly try to give you examples of the sublime in human relationships, right? And both novels really want to put some sort of twist on that, right? They want to put some kind of twist on that. So in terms of like what the novels are, how they fit into literary history, I think that there are some tantalizing parallels, right? I also think that the structure and the sort of core idea of the novels has an underlying similarity, which is that they're both about a character who gets totally obsessed with an idea that is obviously like bad, that is obviously not going to work. And then when it doesn't work, their lives are ruined, and the whole rest of the novel is them kind of trying to figure out what they're going to do, how they're going to overcome the mistake that they've made. And there's also this underlying suspicion in both novels that perhaps the character really hasn't changed that much, right? I think one really interesting difference is that Dostoevsky's background is very Christian, right? Like he wants to convince you that Raskolnikov, or at least he wants to believe that Raskolnikov can change, that this man is totally fallen, but through the power of Christ, he can be fixed, he can be healed. Mary Shelley is much more cynical than that. I think to the bitter end, Frankenstein doesn't like this fundamental problem that he has doesn't change. It's the most immovable part of his personality is this ambition without regard for the consequences. So anyway, I find all of that very interesting. Let's move on to the what I've written as Victor's vacillation. Because this is another thing that I noticed for the first time on this reread, which is just the catastrophic extent to which Victor comes to some of the right conclusions, but he comes to them in ways that suggest to me that he doesn't really understand what he's done wrong. And then he backslides absolutely fucking catastrophically. So he says that he regrets making the monster, and he talks about how he like wants to destroy the monster and blah blah blah. And then once we're back in the frame narrative, once we're like closing out the book, he and Walden have a couple of conversations, and Victor starts to comment on Walden's situation. And the frame narrative is set up to have some really compelling underlying similarities, right? So Walden is also a scientist. He's also trying to make discoveries, and he is also willing to sacrifice human life in order to achieve that, right? He's also kind of transgressing a moral boundary for the sake of expanding our knowledge. And the way that he's doing that is that he's launching an expedition to the North Pole. So he's the captain of a vessel that's going to the North Pole. And people are dying on this expedition, like it's not working out. And by the time that Victor shows up and gets involved, they're kind of stuck in a sheet of ice. And there's a concern that their ship is going to be crushed and they're all going to, drown. Uh, and essentially, Frankenstein, two different things happen in rapid succession. First of all, as they're trapped in the sheet of ice, the entire Frankenstein narration takes place, right? So they're stuck in the sheet of ice, and then Frankenstein narrates his whole thing, and then we leave the Frankenstein narration and we're back in the frame narrative, and Walden and Frankenstein are like talking to each other, and they're still stuck in the ice, and they're kind of deciding what they're gonna do. And the sailors come in. Walden is concerned that there's going to be a mutiny, and the sailors come in and they're like, "Hey, just a heads up, we might mutiny." They do some real like labor organizing type shit, and they choose some people to come in and talk to Walden on behalf of the entire crew, and they say, "Hey, we're really concerned. Like, we're all gonna fucking die, right? That's what it's looking like. But we're really concerned that if the ice starts to melt, you will take us north rather than south. And we just want to make sure that you understand that we want to go south. We want to go home. We've lost time to go home." And what's weird about this is that it seems like, because Frankenstein in the beginning of the novel, he said to Walden, "I can see that you are afflicted with the same sickness that I am, and I want to tell you a story so that you will sort of understand yourself," right? So that heavily implies, like my understanding when I was a kid and I read this was that Victor is saying, learn the lesson that I didn't, right? Learn the lesson that I didn't. That's his explanation for why he's telling the story. But then when we get to the second, when we get to the end of the novel, when we're exiting this frame, Victor says something very different. It's as if by retelling the story, he's kind of changed his mind about the conclusions here. Uh, he he really can't make up his mind, right? He explains his explanation is actually that I'm probably going to die before I can kill the creature, but I want to pass that on to you. It's like a type of fucked up inheritance. He's like, I want you, if you encounter the creature, to kill him. And Victor goes back and forth on whether or not he thinks it's like fair to be doing this, how much he wants Walden to be willing to sacrifice in pursuit of the creature. But anyway, he does try to pass that on to Walden. So over the course of telling the narration, like when he starts telling it, he says, "I I want to warn you about this sickness that I see inside you, and it's already ravaged me," right? And when he ends the story, what he's saying is, you need to kill the monster, right? I get that these things are not exactly like directly contradictory, but it seems like his at the beginning it seems like he is expressing some degree of self-awareness, like don't let ambition ruin your life. But at the end, it seems like that awareness has disappeared, right? He's saying, he's gone from ambition and obsession will ruin your life to please allow my ambition and obsession to persist after I have died. Please take up the obsession that I have, that has led me here. And that's a little different. That's a little different. It's as if in reminiscing, in telling his story, Victor has once again changed his mind about what he wants. He's sort of vacillating back the other way. So he even gives a speech. It's fucking chilling. Like when I saw this, I hadn't noticed it before, but it gave me goosebumps because it's such a minor moment, but it means so much. He explains to Walden as it seems like Victor's dying. He says, "Do not be ambitious. Don't even allow yourself that small ambition, that small and apparently benevolent ambition of just wanting to be the best in the field of science. Okay, even that will lead you astray." And then he says, "But what am I saying? Just because I have failed doesn't mean that the task is impossible." So it's clear to me that what he's saying there, when he talks about the task, he's talking about the task of like overcoming death and creating a person. He is backsliding all the way back, as far back as you possibly can, right? He is saying, actually, maybe it wasn't even a mistake in the first place to create the being, right? So he backslides. So that's one of the things that happens. And then the other thing that happens is when these sailors come in and they say, "Guess what? We want a mutiny. We're going to mutiny if you don't take us south." Frankenstein gets up and this is the most energy that he shows in this part of the novel. He gives a grand stirring speech about how are you gonna be cowards in the face of mortality, or are you gonna look death right in the face, or are you gonna rise to heroism? Are you going to be men, or are you gonna be more than men? And that's what he says. He gives this whole big speech, and it's so disturbing because the speech is essentially asking them to sacrifice their lives on behalf of Walden. Fortunately, Walden is a little bit more measured, right? He says that listen, it's up to the sailors, right? I can't force them to go north. I'm not willing to do that. But he also makes it really clear that if the decision were his alone, he would continue traveling north. So no one has learned any fucking thing from this whole novel, right? No one has fucking learned anything. Not even Walden. And as a matter of fact, it seems like the creature hasn't really learned anything either, because he shows up in this sort of epilogue as well. After Victor dies, the creature shows up and he's like, "Oh, woe is me. I feel so terrible for all the things I've done. I regret everything." And Walden, who really like has shown no real powers of like reflection in regard to himself or in regard to Victor. He looks at the creature and he says, "You don't fucking regret anything, dude. You're fucking lying to me, or you're lying to yourself or something, because if Victor Frankenstein were alive right now instead of dead, if he shuddered and it turned out he had not taken his last breath, you would just go back to the same shit you were doing before, you know? You're obsessed with this revenge, and you know, you're only sad because it worked, right? If it hadn't worked, you would still be focused on the revenge. There's no regret here. I'm not seeing any regret here. And I think this is really interesting, right? I think bringing this back to this incel observation, I think this kind of parallels the way in which a lot of men can sort of see toxic masculinity in incels, but they are completely fail to reflect and recognize toxic masculinity in its more like benign and sneaky forms, right? Like we point to incels and we're like, "Oh man, look at these disgusting men," but they're kind of just expressing a like clearer and more honest version of the cultural narratives that young boys have been fed all of their lives, right? Like, look at this guy. He's a fucking virgin loser, right? And they're just being explicit and clear about like, "Well, you told me that my life wasn't worth living if I couldn't have sex, and I can't have sex, and my conclusion is that I have been cast out of all of society," right? People are able to reflect when they're like pointing at an incel and going, "Haha, you loser." But they're not able to reflect on, they're often unable to see that this is an expression of the same toxic masculinity that all of us are partaking in. And I think Walden expresses a really similar structure here. Like the creature is driven by obsession and a certain type of like madness. Like the disease that makes the creature so like fucked up and insane is to some extent the same one that is affecting Victor and is now affecting Walden. And Walden is pointing at the creature and being like, "Ugh, you gross freak." But he doesn't recognize that the some of the same things, some of the same issues are driving him. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the sexual subtext, right? The sexual subtext is really fun, but I don't exactly know what to do with it. Um, there's a radical feminist reading of Frankenstein that is really, really fun, but it's also a little gross. It makes you feel like a little bit of a pervert. And that radical feminist subtext is that this whole novel is essentially about men's attempt to usurp women. So the way to think about this is to conceptualize Victor as essentially the father and the mother of the monster, right? He has replaced the role of women in the creation of life. One way to think about this is that essentially Victor's goal in the beginning is to give birth without having to be pregnant, right? He wants to make new life, but he doesn't want to do it in the way that nature has ordained. Also, there are many sections where like Shelley definitely knew what she was doing, right? There are many descriptions that like if you're aware of this reading, if you're aware of the this sort of sexual subtext, those passages become very like the word choice that she uses, man, like when the characters early on are talking about the scientific pursuits, they talk about penetrating into the secrets of Mother Nature, which makes this whole thing sound, first of all, extremely like non-consensual, and it characterizes the male scientist as penetrating, and the nature that they're penetrating into as a woman, right? So there's a violation of nature going on here that results in the creation of this creature, and then Frankenstein runs away from it, right? So yeah, there's a radical feminist reading here that is just really, really fun to think about. And I think it opens up a lot of like sexual and gender politics in a book that on the surface level doesn't have that many of them. All right. The last thing I want to talk about actually is something that I don't really have any conclusions about this, but I just want to like kind of ponder it, right? Which is Victor Frankenstein's really like fucking weird early life. So the first chapter in the Frankenstein narration describes his early life and describes basically the circumstances of his birth, and they're very atypical in a variety of ways. The first is that his mom and his dad, problematic age gap relationship. The dad is like, I don't know, 30 years older than the mom. The dad is of the like generation above the mom, right? The situation is that the dad has this like close personal friend, and the friend like super mega crashes out, and his whole family is really really poor, and the daughter is his like last remaining family member, and so Frankenstein's father takes her in and is like, "Don't worry, I'm gonna take care of you. I'm a super rich guy," and eventually they like fall in love with each other, and they get married. Yeah. Um, One thing that my students noted when we were reading this is that this is like very similar to the type of anecdote that would exist in Crime and Punishment, but the difference is that if this were an anecdote in Crime and Punishment, this would not be framed as a positive thing, right? Victor frames this as a positive thing, like, oh, look at this cool, like sublime romance that's happening here. Whereas if this anecdote were being told in a Dostoevsky novel, it would be about this sneaky guy who is not only taking advantage of a young woman sexually, but has convinced himself that in taking advantage of her, he's doing some sort of act of charity, right? And Frankenstein, I'm not sure Mary Shelley is playing this straight, right? I think she wants us to see that to paraphrase another one of my students, something is fucking wrong with these people. Uh, but but Frankenstein's narration certainly plays it straight, right? So there's something up with these people, and that's not even the weirdest thing, right? So the other thing that happens is that Frankenstein has an adoptive, basically I would describe her as an adoptive sister. In one version of the novel, she's a cousin. In another version of the novel, they're not related, but they're raised in the same household. No one really describes her as a sister, but she is a kind of a sister, right? They adopt her at a very young age, and they raise her alongside Frankenstein. And they're told from the beginning, like, you guys are gonna get married. Um, so that's fucked up. Like, I don't know, I don't know what to make of that. Like, it's messed up. Frankenstein's betrothed, his presumed betrothed, is a type of sister to him. Now, I still don't know what to make of this, but one of my students made a really clever observation, which is that when the monster requests that a female monster be made to be his companion, if we view Frankenstein and the monster as having like a son-father relationship, he's essentially requesting his own version of Frankenstein's sister slash fiance, right? He wants Frankenstein to create another child, a child that will, in some sense, be his sibling, be his sister, and then he wants to marry his sister. So there's a parallel there that is, I don't know. There's something to be said about that, but I don't quite know what. Okay, great. Yeah, I think that's it. I got to everything on my list, and I still think there's a lot of unanswered questions here. There's still a lot of things that I'm mulling over and puzzling over. If you have any ideas about what these things mean, please let me know in the comments because I don't know. I demand an answer. I don't really fully understand the telescoping structure and what it does. Like I feel like there's a lot more to be said about that, and I also don't understand like Frankenstein's yucky his like early life. Like other than the fact that it gives us a sense that there's something fucking wrong with these people, I don't really understand what Shelley is doing with all of that. So great. Yeah, if you have any thoughts or ideas on that, please write them in the comments and I will read over them as I always do. All right, that's all for now. Bye bye.